Hey y'all, this is Dr. Johnson, and this is your environmental ethics lecture today. and so what I wanted to do is go ahead and review a little bit about Reagan, and then I want to talk about MaryAnne Warren and her concern about Reagan's animal rights argument. And then we're going to preview a little bit about John Stuart Mill, and we will be talking about John Stuart Mill tomorrow in class. And I'll be uploading this outline to Canvas so you can look at it if you want to. So first of all, I just wanted to remind you of Reagan's argument, and recall that I did record a lecture on Reagan for you, and you can find this lecture link on Canvas. It takes you to a YouTube video that I posted there. All right, well, so anyhow, Reagan believes that fully grown mammals are an experiencing subject of life. And by fully grown mammal, I think that, he's just talking about probably what you think he's talking about. Things like dogs and cats and gorillas and giraffes and bears and lions and that sort of thing. And when he says that they are an experiencing subject of life, he talks about in his article that this means that they have some goals that they're trying to achieve. They at least have some kind of memory. They have projects, even if they're very basic, that are important to them. And these projects are things like being able to find food and water and have a pleasurable life that makes them feel good. They might not think to themselves, I want to have a pleasurable life. Rather, they just have this drive to do pleasurable things that make them feel good, to have a mate, to pass on their offspring, if they're domesticated animals, to get attention and affection from their owners, things like this. And so Reagan certainly understands that animals, as far as we know, do not experience life perhaps at the same depth we do, because they don't have the type of creativity and moral decision-making capacities that humans have. Nevertheless, again, they have certain projects and experiences that are meaningful to them to the extent that their life can go better or worse. And so this is why they're an experiencing subject of a life. Okay. So Reagan thinks that because they're an experiencing subject of a life, that they have intrinsic value independent of their usefulness to others, that life they experience has an intrinsic value of their own. And then he further argues that they have rights because of this intrinsic value. And the argument that he's making, it appears, is that the fact that this life that they experience, this unique life, is unique to them, that gives that life that value. That life deserves to be preserved and protected. And it appears that that's the inherent, the locus of the inherent rights Reagan believes that they have. And Reagan doesn't say this for sure, but he does leave the possibility open that other natural things like rocks and glaciers might have rights as well. We don't know for sure. And he says we actually don't have to know for the sake of his argument, which is, again, just focusing on animal rights. Well, MaryAnne Warren writes her article in direct response and critique to Reagan's argument. And one of the things that she primarily points out in critique of Reagan's argument is that it's not really clear what exactly Reagan means by intrinsic value. So Warren's contention is that Reagan's definition of intrinsic value is primarily a negative one, that it primarily focuses on what intrinsic value is not. And namely, what he points out in his article is that intrinsic value isn't really connected to whether or not somebody finds a particular animal useful or not, a mammal useful or not. And so Reagan is saying, hey, look, whether or not we think things like cats or dogs or giraffes or bears or lions are useful, they still have intrinsic value. So again, Warren thinks that Reagan's case for animal rights, this intrinsic value idea, is not very well defined, and it's really nebulous. Now, you'll have to decide whether or not you think that is true based on what Reagan talks about intrinsic rights in his article. But another point that Warren makes, and I'll go ahead and highlight here so you can track what I'm saying. Another point that Warren makes is that she's not sure where we draw the line with what has intrinsic value and what does not. Now, you might remember, and I'll highlight this point up here, that Reagan says, look, I could be opening the door to say that things like rocks and glaciers and perhaps trees have rights as well. But he says, I'm not really concerned about dealing with that right now because it's not really pertinent to whether or not animals have rights. Okay, well, I think Warren isn't satisfied with that. And I think the reason why is because she says, well, look, we might be talking about animal rights right now, but eventually the reasoning that we apply to animals, we're probably going to have to apply to other creatures as well. So for instance, if we say that mammals have rights because of this intrinsic worth that they have, and this intrinsic worth maybe is somehow connected to being a subject, an experiencing subject of a life, where do we draw the line and say this mammal is an experiencing subject of a life, but for instance, this bird or this octopus or this worm or this snake or this tree or this fungus is not an experiencing subject of a life? How exactly do we draw that line? And it may seem like it's a little bit hair splitting to get all worried about where we're going to draw the line. But I think that her point is that it's not clear where we would draw the line. And if it's not clear where we would draw the line, what that seems to suggest is that perhaps we might say, look, flies and spiders and worms and snakes and maybe grass and maybe trees are also experiencing subjects of a life, and therefore they have equal rights to us, and we shouldn't mess with them. And of course, you can see potentially how that kind of reasoning could end us up in some absurd circumstances. So it might be, if we take that reasoning to really extreme conclusions, we would say things like, look, you can't kill spiders. Maybe you can't mow the lawn. It's not right to chop down trees. It's certainly not right to eat any animals at all. Now, by the way, there are some Buddhists that think that we should not kill spiders, and that we should not eat any animals. And so I do want to point out that there are some people, and by the way, you can be one of these people, this is absolutely a moral position, who believe that it is wrong to kill any life, especially a life that we can avoid killing. So I think a lot of Buddhists believe, of course, that we can kill in self-defense. But a lot of them would say, look, you don't have to kill a spider. You don't have to kill a mouse. You could relocate it, so you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't kill it. Okay, but Warren does think that this lands us in some potentially difficult situations or problematic situations. This reasoning takes us to perhaps conclusions that are really extreme. So, and I should have added this point here, and I'm going to do this right now. Warren argues, doing this as I'm talking. So Warren argues for weaker animal rights. And it is important to note that she is not saying that animals should have no rights. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. She actually does think that animals have rights, but she thinks that animals have weaker rights than human beings. And here's why. She says only human beings can reason morally. And what's really important to note for her argument is that she's not saying that the fact that human beings can reason morally, she's not saying that that makes them smarter or that it even makes them better than animals. But it does give them a certain capacity, and namely, it gives them a greater capacity or capability for cooperation and nonviolence. In other words, what Warren is arguing here, I believe, she doesn't specifically spell this out, but I think she's pointing out that human beings' moral reasoning capacities give them the ability to be able to reason and work for cooperation and nonviolence and a more peaceful and better world for everyone and everything, and that animals don't have that capacity. And so she's saying that human beings have to have their rights protected. They have to have equal rights. And the reason why she believes that is because the same capacity that causes human beings to be able to work for cooperation and nonviolence also is the capacity when rights are not protected. It can lead human beings to some of the most heinous and horrible crimes in the world. So for instance, please pardon me that this is kind of a graphic example of non-cooperation and of violence. But human beings, when they don't honor each other's equal rights, often end up doing things like enslaving people or committing genocide or committing horrible sexual crimes against people, like in the case of sex trafficking. So I'd like to point out here that what Warren is saying is that whatever capacity this moral reasoning capacity is, it's the capacity that makes it that we need to treat human beings with equal rights, because when we don't, that capacity gets flipped on its head and human beings become the absolute worst of creatures and do the most violent and horrible things to each other in a way that animals don't. So for instance, animals don't enslave each other and commit genocide and don't sex traffic. Pardon me again for these rather graphic images. And these seem to be connected to human beings' moral capacity, the right exercising of it, or the destruction of it. And so Warren says, it doesn't make sense to talk about animals having equal rights as to human beings, because they can't reason morally. And so they're just not the kind of creature that can be treated with equal moral rights. Now, she does point out that some people might mistake her argument for the kind of argument that permits us to treat human beings that can't reason morally as lesser human beings and to violate their rights. And she says, no, my argument doesn't allow for that, because human beings are always of the kind of species or creature that can reason morally. And just because some of them can't doesn't mean that they aren't a part of the human species anymore. It just means that somehow this capacity has been blocked or disabled or something like that. So she's not making any kind of argument in her article that that her argument would permit us to treat, for instance, disabled people or older people that have dementia or Alzheimer's as less than human. All right. Now, what we do need to note is that she says that even though animals do not have equal rights as to human beings, she still thinks that we should speak of them as having rights in a weaker sense. And one of her primary reasons for this is because she says, so look, the way people tend to talk about morality today is in the sense of right. So we aren't always sure how to agree about things morally, but what we do tend to agree upon is that human beings should have certain kinds of rights. So rights language holds a lot of traction for contemporary society, even though morality language doesn't always have a lot of traction. And so what her concern is that if we don't if we don't argue for any rights for animals, that people might conclude that they can do whatever they want with them. And she thinks that that's not correct, that just because animals do not have moral reasoning capacities does not mean then that they have no rights or they don't have any value. So again, Warren is not arguing for equal rights between humans and animals. Rather, she is arguing that animals do have rights, but they have a weaker kind of rights than human beings do. And if you look on page 78 in the conclusion of this article, of Warren's article, she actually shares three things, or three aspects of this weaker rights theory. And I'll just name two of them. So the first one is that she tends to agree with Reagan that there is a way that animals' life does matter to them. And if that is the case, then it seems like animals should that we should treat animals in such a way that they are able to pursue this life that is meaningful to them, and to be able to develop it fully. And then secondly, and there's a third one too, but I'll just point to the second one. And then she says that we should not disrupt or end this life unless there's a really good reason to do so. And there's a third point too. I'll let you check that on your own. It's important to note that Warren doesn't give a lot of practical implications for what her theory means, but she thinks, and she's not trying to do that in the article. Remember, she's critiquing Reagan's idea of intrinsic worth and equal rights. But she gives 3 points at the end that I think potentially could lead to some practical implications. All right. And then John Stuart Mill, that's the article you were to read for today, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. Here's what you should know about John Stuart Mill. So let me quote this, what he writes. This is on page 105 of your book. He's trying to point out that there are two different things that people can mean when they talk about the word nature. He says it thus appears, and I'm going to enlarge this a little bit just to make sure that you can see it. It thus appears that we must recognize at least two principal meanings of the word nature. In one sense, it means all the powers existing in either the outer or inner world and everything which takes place by means of those powers. In another sense, it means not everything which happens, but only what takes place without the agency or without the voluntary and intentional agency of man. Okay. Now, here's why Mill is very concerned about what the word nature means. So very frequently, people will make a statement to this effect. They'll say something like, we should do what is natural, or we should let nature guide us, or what is natural is best. And Mill is going to discuss in his article that there are some potential problems with this idea that what is natural is best, or that we should follow nature, or that perhaps there's a way that what is natural is morally superior and that which should guide us. Now, on the one hand, before we get to Mill's concern with this, on the one hand, there's something right about those statements. And here's what I mean by that. Here's an example. So we know that human beings are naturally wired to rest. And they're also naturally wired, for instance, to spend some time in nature. So all throughout history, human beings have spent time, they've been in nature regularly. And so that's kind of part of our evolutionary and biological makeup. So here's the point. We know that it is unnatural to make humans work 24 hours a day, say inside in this room with no windows. We understand that would be completely against nature and a horrible thing to do to human beings. I mean, really a horrible thing to do to anyone or anything. So in that sense, there is a way that we must let nature guide us, and that what is natural is probably the best for us. There's a way that's true. But there's also a way it's not true. And here's why. And this is Mill's concern. So nature is largely amoral. When we think of nature in terms of like the laws of nature and the cycles of nature and like the evolutionary processes of nature and how animals interact with each other. So here are just two examples. So lions kill other animals like gazelle and antelope, and like they'll chase them down and rip them apart. And we know that that's an amoral thing that lions do. That's not a moral fault of lions. That's what they are instinctually and biologically driven to do. And in fact, they don't really have any choice about that because animals don't have free will. They don't have moral reasoning. As far as we know, no animals do, or at least not very many, and not to the developed degree that a lot of humans do. So the point is, we don't put lions on trial for killing antelopes or gazelle and tearing them apart and eating them. But we do put human beings on trial because that is a bad thing for human beings to do to each other. You don't do that to other human beings. As a second example, we all have watched the news or personally experienced hurricanes or tornadoes coming in and just completely destroying a city, or a forest, or some other type of landscape. And when hurricanes and tornadoes do that, nature doesn't care. It doesn't care if it's destroying people's lives, their houses, a city, their livelihood, landscapes, because those forces of nature are amoral, which means they don't have moral principles. And again, we don't put them on trial for that. We understand that's nature. Nature doesn't have moral reasoning. But that's Mill's point, is that you have to be really careful what you mean by the word nature when you say things like nature knows best, or nature should be our guide, or what is natural is best, or that sort of thing. Because on the one hand, it's true, but on quite a few other hands, it's absolutely not true because of the fact that nature is amoral. All right, so we're going to revisit that tomorrow and explore it. And by the way, what we're going to be looking at now, so you might remember that in the first couple of weeks, what we were looking at is the relationship of human beings to nature, and what that relationship should be, hierarchical or egalitarian or that sort of thing. And then we were looking at animal rights, how we might relate to animals and whether we should be equal or superior. Well, so now what we're doing is moving into a unit where we examine whether ethics should be human-based, and driven by human concerns, or if there could be some other foundation for ethics. All right, thank you for listening. Feel free to write if you have any questions.